Kia ora rā tātou. Hoi anō, he tūpoto tēnei ki te mihi ki te rōpū ko haramai tēnei ata. Tēnā koutou haramai ki te whakanui i tēnei rā whakahirehira mō tātou. Haramai hoki ki tēnei kauhau o tātou o te kurutoi tangata. Ka nui te mihi ko haramai ki te whakanui. Ka kore nei e wareware, te whakanui o tātou Kīngitanga tō whānau. Pai noi ko taino hoki ka hui ariki. Nā reira, huri noa rā haramai rā ki tēnei o ngā kauhau. Ka huri hoki ki ngā kai kauhau kua tai mai i tēnei ata, tēnā kōrua tahu. Ross, ka nui te mihi, ka kōrua ko haramai, ko whakai mai ke haramai, kua whakanui i tēnei rā mō tātou katoa. Nā reira, ka nui te koa, kua haramai, ko whakai mai, kia kauhau i o whakao. Nā reira, huri noi tēnei ruma ka nui te koa, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Well, it gives me great pleasure this morning to welcome you all here to Faculty of Education talks. And today, this morning, we're dealing with Hauora Māori health. And it gives me, as I say, gives me great pleasure to introduce our two guest speakers. We have a third coming, I'm sure. Tom, I'm sure, will be here soon. But we've got two very well-informed, very well-known, highly researched people who are going to give our coho today about Hauora Māori. I think tahu ko koe te tatahi ne, a ko korasu rāne, kai kei te whai. So Tahu Kukutai is our first speaker. She has a wonderful history of working in the Māori world, in Māori health, and she is going to give us her talk about her perspectives on Māori health and Hauora. Nā reira, tēnā koe, nau mai haramai rā. If you can join me in welcoming Tahu. Just get rid of that one there.
Ko te mea tuatahi, ka nui te mihi ki a Kīngitanga me tōna whare kāhui ariki, tā tui hoki tātou i tau nei, pai mārire ki a rātou, ko ai au, ko Tahu Kukutai tōku ingoa, hu uri a hau ne no Ngāti Tipa, Ngāti Ngā Wairo, Ngāti Kino Haku Te Ao Pauri. Tēnā koe e ho mō tō mihi ki a tātou i tēnei ata. Ka nui te mihi ki a koe e ho. Tēnā rā tātou katoa. Always a surprise when you think you're going to be the last speaker and you're the first. Because you're speed reading your notes from the sideline, and some of you would have done that, no doubt, in the past. I'm actually not really a Māori health researcher. I'm a population researcher. Actually, initially started off as an historian, then morphed into a demographer and a sociologist. So actually the way I sort of approach my research is pretty kind of interdisciplinary. And I'll let Ross talk about Māori health. What I'm going to talk about really is Māori wellbeing from a fairly sort of broad-based perspective, and then come into some of the population researches, which is really the bread and butter of what I do at NIDIA, which is an institute here at the University of Waikato. I want to start off with a picture here of some of my nieces and nephews and my kōtiro. To me, that's what kind of Māori wellbeing, or the future of Māori wellbeing, looks like anyway. I'm going to show you a lot of numbers and graphs and figures and all that sort of stuff, which I'll explain, but I think it's always important to remember that actually underneath that is the people, and that's really what matters. So what do I mean by wellbeing? It's kind of it's an elastic concept that gets talked about a lot without really kind of defining what is meant by that. Recently I was really lucky to be doing a project with Linda Smith, who some of you might know. She's a PVC Māori here and very well known in the Indigenous world for her research methodologies. And we were doing a project funded by Ngā Pai o Te Maramatanga called In Pursuit of the Possible, which is a really cool title, as it evokes sort of aspirational research rather than a lot of the depressing stuff that we end up doing for our bread and butter. And one of the things that we tried to contribute there was understanding what is Indigenous concepts of well-being actually mean? I mean, we might know as individuals intuitively what we think well-being means, but is there kind of an indigenous worldview of well-being? And if so, what does that indigenous worldview of well-being actually look like? So there's many ways you might embark on trying to find out what that might mean. And one of the ways we did that, because we're academics, is you look at a whole lot of literature, the hundreds and hundreds of papers that have been written on Indigenous well-being, kind of prioritising Indigenous academics to try and distill, if there are some sort of key concepts, underlying concepts of well-being, what might they look like? So we read through hundreds of journal articles and coded them and did all the analysis, and we came up with what's really kind of these four underlying pool of what well-being looks like. Regardless of context, this was looking at different countries, it was looking at different people, Sami, First Nations, Métis, Australian Aboriginals, American Indians, Māori, Asia, Africa. Okay, so aha ko ngā whāngata, these are the four principles that sort of cohere. And one of them is freedom, and that gets talked about in a variety of ways. So that could mean rights, justice, autonomy, tino rangatiratanga, justice. There's different ways of thinking about freedom, but this fundamental freedom as a people is a key kind of component of well-being. Another one is balance, and often this gets talked about in terms of harmony, balance, a sort of equilibrium, relationship between people and whenua and moana in the natural environment, and that is being a key part of well-being as Indigenous peoples. Another one, this one here, is about surviving and thriving. And one of the things that kind of a common experience really that binds Indigenous experience is the experience of colonisation. And what's kind of underappreciated, particularly in contemporary health research, is what that impact of colonisation has actually had on contemporary Indigenous health outcomes. And so for many Indigenous peoples, and I'll show you a graph, just merely surviving that experience is an indicator of well-being. But once you survive, what does thriving actually look like? And how far are we on that scale of surviving to thriving? And the last one, and this is probably a key one, Tomurua. Are you there? No, all right. And this is a key one, is distinctive identity. If you no longer have your distinctive identity, your culture, your reo, those things that make you who you are as a people, then how can you have well-being? So these are the four components that came through and what well-being looks like. So I'm just going to keep that in your kind of minds while I go through this other stuff. So what does our history of surviving actually look like? I love historical demography. I do quite a bit of it, so I find this stuff quite fascinating. Hopefully you will too. Because I'm going to show you some graphs. Sorry. All right, so this is kind of our amazing decline and recovery. And these two bits here, it's kind of confusing when you've got two screens. one might be a bit easier. But here we've got our population numbers from 100,000 to 600,000. This is time along the bottom. So let's just focus on that one for the moment. So you can see that in 1858, actually if we went back to 1840, it would be around 100,000. Okay, so I kind of missed out a bit of the story. 1858 up to 2006, I didn't have time to add 2013. And you can see here that the numbers are very, very small. And actually if I had 1840, you would have seen even more of a decline. Okay, and then it increased further along here. Now the second axis shows our population share of the whole population of Aotearoa. And here you can see this very, very rapid decline here, okay, from basically being 50% at the time of the signing of the treaty. If I went before that, of course, we were 100%. Okay, and then you get this massive drop. Now that massive drop is what you see in a lot of Indigenous populations. Okay, and that's not only a drop in absolute numbers, how many people there are, but also a massive drop in the kind of dominance that you have in the population, your demographic visibility. So these kind of big shocks have massive impacts on Indigenous peoples, not only in the past, not only our tūpunas, but they continue to have reverberations in the present. Now you might look at that and say, okay, well, why does that happen? What can explain that? There's a lot of things that explain that, okay, that are common. Invasion. Implosion in the context of Aotearoa, the implosion of iwi economies that actually existed at the time of colonisation. In Waikato we know that our land was stolen, raupatu. Disease, swamping, swamping here was through immigration, okay? So you've got a kind of a double whammy effect, not only of increased mortality through disease, malnutrition, starvation, linked to confiscation of land. At the same time, you've got mass immigration coming in. So these kind of two destabilising factors are happening basically at the same time, creating a sort of perfect storm. And of course, ongoing poverty, which didn't stop here when we saw the population start to increase, but continues on to the present days, we very well know, with child poverty and all sorts of issues that have been in the news on a pretty much a daily basis. So we survived. There were lots. At this point, where the star is, it shouldn't really be a star. It should probably be some other sort of less promising symbol. That was basically the low point of the Māori population, reached about 40,000 from about 100,000 in a very short period of time. And there were many commentators, mainly Pākehā, but also Māori, who kind of thought, well, actually, will we survive as a people? And that was kind of like that brink of thinking about survivorship. But then it became very evident, and particularly in more recent decades, that absolutely we are surviving. There's no doubt about it. We're heading towards the 1 million mark. But what does this mean in terms of thriving, that other key dimension of well-being? And just because I'm a demographic nerd and I just like to show some other graphs, as well as, we've gone through a lot of major transitions, and one of them, which will certainly affect all of your whānau as well, is this kind of fertility transition from having many, many babies in our whānau to having very, very few on average, although we all know exceptions. So here you can see this is the green line is all females, so that's the whole kind of New Zealand average, and the red one is Māori females. We don't have anything over there because we don't have any data. But the main point here is you can again see that very sharp decline. Okay, so that's going from on average about 6 pepe per woman down to about just over 2. Okay, and that happened in a very short space of time. In fact, that was one of the most rapid declines in fertility seen in any population anywhere in the world at any time. Okay, and that has massive implications for whānau and how we see ourselves and the not so much the relationships we have, but kind of the availability of relationships. And one really easy kind of illustration of that is whāngai. Right, so in the past, certainly my dad and all of his cousins were whāngai of some sort, the kind of circulation of pepe, tamariki around whānau, nearly always related in some way. You can do that when you've got an average of 6 kids. Okay, now if you've got an average of just over 2 kids, the cultural meaning of institution of whāngai still endures, but the ability to actually practice it is squeezed a lot because you simply don't have the children to be able to do that. So that's just kind of one tangible way in which our practices are impacted by these larger shifts in the population. And that's my, just to kind of put this in tangible terms, this is my my husband's grandmother, Kuia, who stays with us a lot, Zita Tapa. She was a mātaumua of 17 children raised in a 2-bedroom house in Ahipara. And this is her great-granddaughter, who's one of one. So, that's, in the space of a couple of generations, you've got this massive shifts, okay, in the same whānau. And of course, we're always on the move. Māori love to move. Our tūpunas move to come from Hawaii to Aotearoa, and we're always on the move. This here was what you might think of as the second Māori migration. This is probably our grandparents, maybe your great-grandparents, who moved from rural areas into urban areas after World War II. Okay, and places like the Hokianga basically emptied out overnight, literally emptied out overnight, and you can see that in a lot of the numbers. And again, you've got that really sharp line because it happened in a very short period of time. So Māori went from being a largely rural people to an almost entirely urbanised people in a very short space of time. So you've got to think about what does that do to hapu, marae and iwi structures. Okay, you might think about it in big terms, but it kind of trickles down and has very localised effects as well. And of course, we know that about 1 in 5 and 1 in 6 Māori live overseas. Wasn't that a brilliant show, the GC? Fine piece of television, yeah. And this is my nieces and nephews who were born and raised in Australia. So there's about 130,000 more now, but in the last census, about 130,000 Māori living in Australia, 1/3 of whom were actually Australian born, and more Māori living in Queensland than there are in 10 of New Zealand's 16 regions. So this is not just a kind of like a small side issue, it's actually a major transformation in Te Ao Māori. And so our population history really is a remarkable story of back from the brink, and this is true for many Indigenous peoples. We're kind of demographic innovators in a way, so we've gone from survival into thriving mode, but it's not entirely clear how far we are on that thriving mode, and we'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But it's also important to note that actually, while we have some shared common experiences, we're actually pretty unique in the Indigenous world. One of the things that we have, and Native Hawaiians have as well, is we have a single language. Okay, so when you're thinking about that distinctive identity and about language revitalisation, it makes it a hell of a lot easier to achieve if you've got one language, not 500. Okay, it's a lever that's advantageous. Another one is we have a very high demographic visibility, which I'll get to. So we're about 16% of the national population. For First Nations people, American Indians, Australian Aboriginals, that's like 1 to 3%. You know, and numbers actually do matter. When you're trying to get political, that's a fun little tune. When you're trying to get some political change, it's a bit easier to do it if you're a big share of the population than if you're a little share of the population. All right, so thriving or surviving. So people often say to me, well, how many Māori are there? And you know, there's not actually a simple answer to that, because if you look at the census, which is where they kind of do all the population count, there's lots of different indicators of Māori identity. There's no single one, which might sound ridiculous to some people because you'll just say, well, it's whakapapa, obviously. That's the indicator of Māori identity, right? But the way it gets counted in the census is very different. So at the biggest, most inclusive criteria is Māori descent. That's a question that you tick. It says, are you of Māori descent, or do you have a Māori grandparent or great-grandparent? And people go and tick that box. So based on that question, there was about 668,000 Māori in the last census. Then there's another question that says, what ethnic group are you? And that's meant to be like a cultural question. And based on that question, there was 598,000. That's about 70,000 less. It's quite significant. Yeah. So there's about 70,000 people who say that they're Pākehā or European, culturally or ethnically, but they acknowledge that they have a Māori ancestor there somewhere. And then we had a question on iwi. Do you know at least one of your iwi? Yes, write it down. Smaller again at 535,000. And then if you took a core of all people who say yes ancestry, yes ethnicity, yes iwi, you've got a much smaller bit in the middle there, which is about 40%. So depending on how you're thinking about it, you can have relatively small to a relatively large population. From a Māori perspective, probably descent is the best indicator because that's one of just kind of whakapapa in a way, although it's not connected to an iwi. And the latest estimate's about 712,000 Māori and fast heading towards 1 million, which sounds really sexy. I'm not really sure what it means. I suspect it won't mean all that much if that surviving to thriving doesn't change, because it's all well and good having lots of people. But if the quality of life isn't improving, then that's obviously a major problem. Okay, I'm going to race through some other stuff. So one of the things when I showed you that, you know, that reduction in the number of babies, that big fertility decline that we had, means that we've got a very different age structure. And this actually has some important consequences. On the right-hand side, this is the Pākehā age structure. It's kind of like a sausage, yeah? So it's kind of like straight down. And what's happening there is you're getting a lot of people moving into the older ages. On the left-hand side, we've got the Māori age structure with all these lovely young people here. And it's more like a triangle, yeah? Because what you've got a lot of younger people at the base and fewer older people at the top. Now, when you've got these two things side by side, what that creates actually is an opportunity. Because when you've got structural ageing, you're getting an increasing amount of people moving out of the working ages, okay? And economies need people in the working ages to drive the economy, okay? But for Māori, we've got plenty of future workers who can drive that economy, but that's only going to really mean something if we put meaningful investment into our rangatahi. And yes, iwi can do that, but actually it's a major government responsibility. And some of the mahi that's been coming out of our institute, particularly when Matthew Jackson was there, is that we've got this potential Māori demographic dividend that's being wasted through policies that aren't investing where they need to invest in order to really benefit from this age structure sitting alongside this age structure. Okay, so we're talking about that kind of distinctiveness. If you think back to that model of freedom, balance, surviving, thriving, distinctive identity, one of those might be seen as kind of our visibility. What does our visibility as Māori look like? And we can look at the national level with some 600,000, which is about 16% nationally. But actually, we don't live our lives in the nation. We live our lives in communities, and we live our lives in regions. And how visible Māori are varies tremendously depending actually which part of Aotearoa you're living in. So the red, that's a map, a map by territorial authority. There's about 67 of them in the country. But all you really need to know is that the red areas means at least 40% of those areas are Māori. So it probably confirms what you already know, which is that those Māoris those areas of high Māori demographic visibility are in the far north of the motu, on the east coast, and around here I think that's Ruapehu, that's 61, 60, yeah, around Ruapehu, and then 40 those red ones, which is about 30 to 39%, that's South Waikato and Rotorua. Yeah. So, and then the South Island is low, a very low proportion of Māori in the South Island. So when you're talking about kind of Māori, like thinking about it at a national one-size-fits-all way is actually out of step with this massive amount of variation that we actually have across the country. So in Wairoa, you've got more than 60% of the population is Māori. Kawerau, Opotiki, Gisborne in the far north. If you're kind of going to leverage distinctive identity and the good things about Te Ao Māori, these would be good places to do it. And certainly you've got much higher levels of te reo speakers in those areas because you're surrounded by a lot of Māori people, right? Areas where Māori are basically demographically invisible include Queenstown, Waimate, Waitaki, Mackenzie and Selwyn, where less than 10% of the population are Māori. So these are massive, massive differences in one relatively small country. Talking about education and that kind of thriving, a lot of policy is around education, and myself I've said that yes, education is absolutely critical for realising that demographic dividend. But again, there's a massive amount of variation throughout the motu as well. So if we look at the territorial authorities, if we took one indicator, which is no education, no qualification, that means no NCEA level 2 or anything like that, nothing. And you looked at Māori throughout the country, then the smallest, the areas that had the lowest proportion of Māori with no qualification. Okay, so another if you flip that over, the areas where Māori are kind of well educated, there's no surprise there's Wellington, and that's largely through migration. You've got a massive public service Māori population in Wellington, and they're highly educated. So they usually come from other parts of the motu to work there. There's nothing particularly about Wellington. You've got Queenstown, Dunedin, University effect, Selwyn, Kapiti, Palmerston North, University effect, Upper Hutt, Porirua, Hamilton, University effect, and Christchurch. So those cities where you've got universities will also often have higher levels of education, yeah? Now, if you look at the other end, where are the areas where you've got high shares of the Māori population with no qualification whatsoever, it's much higher. So South Waikato, Tararua, Stratford, Horowhenua, Southern Taranaki, Goa, Matamata, Otorohanga, Ruapehu and Waitomo. Now the interesting thing is a lot of these are actually in the Waikato region. And so you've got these kind of polarisation of Hamilton for Māori with quite high levels, low levels of low education, and other areas with high levels of low education. This is all within one region. So again, that kind of one size fits all is not going to be particularly helpful. There needs to be really kind of localised responses to education, I think. But I'll leave that for the educationalists to talk about. And just to emphasise those two separate ends, that's 15 to 45, that's a massive difference. So we've also got the usual gaps in systemic inequities, education, labour market, income, child poverty, incarceration, te me. I could go on for ages about that, but I won't because you already know it. So what about our distinctiveness, that other part of that wellbeing model that I showed early on? Te reo Māori is an ongoing challenge. This comes from the census, and what it shows is by ages, 5-year age groups, There's a question in the census, you might remember that you've filled it out yourself, or your mum and dad might have done it for you, which is, in what language can you hold a daily conversation? So it's about your ability with conversational ability in any language, and te reo was one of them. In 1996 is the blue line, and 2013 is the orange line. So one of the things that you immediately notice is that in most age groups, the blue line is a lot bigger than the orange line, okay? So that means that there's been a decline over time. The other thing that's really noticeable is that as you go up the ages, you get higher proportions being able to speak the reo as well. So there's those two things. Now, most of the difference that you'll see is over here. Okay, so just to put that in simple terms, so back in 1996, we think about kaumātua and kuia, of Māori who were aged about 60 to 64, about 50% could have conversational te reo. Yeah? But then fast forward to 2013, in that same age group, only about 27%, almost decreased by half, could actually have a daily conversation in the reo. Now, why might that be? When you think about it, those in 2013 who were in those kind of pre-kaumātua ages were the ones who actually, in the earlier slide, had gone from that rural to urban transition. Okay? And so, and it was also before the Māori Renaissance. There was no opportunities to acquire the reo through wānanga, through university, through other sort of educational initiatives. So these sort of cohorts that were stuck in the middle of not kind of growing up with Māori as their first language, of kind of shifting away from those institutions that would have enabled that, and then being kind of too old to take advantage of those educational initiatives. So to a large extent, we've got these kind of rather large cohorts of Māori adults now who didn't really have the ability and the access to the reo in ways that would enable those sorts of blue lines to endure. And part of the policy response to that, and iwi and community response to that, has to be kind of acknowledging that and figuring out, okay, well then how do we provide age-appropriate ways as well to enable our kaumātua and kuia to have access to that part of our identity as a people. There's a really interesting survey called Te Kupenga, which was the first Māori social survey, and it asked a lot of questions about identity and just simple things like, do you know your maunga, do you know your awa, do you know your hapu, and do you know your iwi? And that might sound like real basic questions, but there's nowhere else that you can actually get some data around that sort of stuff. So if you think that, distinctive identity, one of the basic measures of distinctive identity is knowing where you're from through pēpiha, then it's really interesting to know that. And this is Māori adults, okay, so it's only 15 and above. And of course, you've always got high levels of iwi affiliation, around about 85 to 88%, depending on which survey you're looking at. But hapu, maunga were only about half. Only about half of Māori in those surveys knew who their maunga, knew their hapu, and knew their awa. And actually, it's probably lower than that because the survey didn't say write it down. Okay, it was just do you know? But actually, if you had to write it down, it would probably be lower. Connections to marae tupuna are actually still pretty strong, 70%. And none of the above, so knowing nothing, is actually really low. So I think that kind of needs to be seen in the context of colonisation and kind of policies which actively sought to diminish Māori identity. The fact that this actually endures is a kind of a miracle, actually. And so whether it's good or whether it's bad or whether it's high or whether it's low, it's kind of a value judgment set against what? I still see it as a really solid foundation for increasing access and for building on identity, building on knowledge at local levels. But you kind of got to start somewhere. I might race through the rest, otherwise I'll take up all your time, Ross. Now, there's a lot of discourse around this kind of opposition between urban Māori and iwi Māori, as if we kind of neatly fall into these two different camps. And I think it's not a very helpful distinction, and actually it's not one that actually has much meaning. And it doesn't have much meaning in a way because more than 85% of Māori actually live in urban areas. To a large extent, most of us are urban dwelling Māori. At the same time, the vast majority of Māori affiliate with an iwi. If anything, these two things are mutually constituted rather than oppositional. And actually the greatest growth in iwi affiliation has been for Māori who are living in urban areas. So this kind of urban Māori versus iwi Māori is one that I think is one that needs to be looked at and kind of interrogated quite carefully. Now when you're looking at iwi population growth, it's quite fascinating because it doesn't conform to any sort of model, demographic model that nerdy demographers like to look at. Because there's three things that might grow a population, right? Is births, deaths, and migration. And as Indigenous peoples, you largely have the migration factor not available because you're living in your own homeland. There's no other Māori land that exists out there that we can get Māoris from, although some might argue that Queensland is fast becoming that way. So you've only got the lever really of births and deaths, right? So you just want to have more babies than you have deaths. What's interesting for iwi is that you've also got another lever, and this is this kind of reconnection with whakapapa and reconnection with identity. And you see that really closely, or really evidently, when you look at some of the massive population growth that's happened with a lot of iwi in the last 10, 20 years. That cannot be explained by more babies and deaths. It's just simply impossible. The only way you can explain it is that people who didn't previously identify with that iwi subsequently do so. Why they do that, any number of reasons, whether it's personal, whether it's political, whether it's whānau, whether it's changing context, whatever, there's any number of reasons to explain it, but the fact is that there's been massive growth. And so when you look at Waikato in 1991 from 22,000, and then it stays stagnant, and then it goes up, and then it goes down, and then it goes up again, and almost doubles in the space of 21 years. Of course that's impossible demographically. Impossible. There's no way that can happen. It's due to changing patterns of identification. And this line here is the settlement. Okay, 1996 New Zealand. Big surge after the settlement, and then down, actually lost numbers, and then up again. And that's one of the fascinating kind of things for us as Māori, and actually similar patterns for American Indian tribes as well, is that we have our own kind of rhythms, population rhythms, that you don't really see with other people. And just to illustrate, so that's for Waikato iwi, increased by 80%. Māori as a whole, only 38%, in New Zealand, only 26%. Okay, and depending on which iwi you're looking at, it's going to look different. We've looked at Ngaitahu, Waikato, Tūhoi, Ngatiawa, Kahungunu, all different. There is no one iwi population pattern. Again, a one-size-fits-all is not going to be particularly useful. So the future, we're heading towards 1 million Māori. So around 1 million by 2033, which is not that far off. It sounds cool, and it sounds a lot, but of course we've got a very liberal immigration policy in this country, which Māori have no input into. And so the growth of migrant populations is growing very rapidly, not through fertility, but through migration. And now in the OECD countries, we're only second behind Australia in terms of the proportion foreign born. So, about 24% of New Zealand people living in New Zealand now born overseas. In Australia, it's about 28%. And Auckland, it's about 40%. And that's happened in a very short period of time. And it has implications, I think. Māori migrant relationships are not well understood. Māori have very little input into migration policy, politically or in any other way. And it raises a whole set of questions which can play out very differently in different regions, I think, and will particularly be consequential for our rangatahi. So, sometimes I think we're a little too insular and just kind of looking at ourselves and not really looking at the broader context and what's actually happening in Aotearoa, and migration is a major one. And I don't think it's particularly helpful to approach it from a xenophobic Winston Peters sort of standpoint. There's lots of layers and nuances to what these relationships look like, and I think we should really be at the forefront of saying what they are. So what is the potential that can be harnessed from this critical mass? There's obviously a lot of structural inequities that endure that need to be harnessed. There's been a very kind of top-down approach. And I think, in a post-settlement context, iwi have tried to address that in various ways. But often that's a very kind of, sometimes that can be a corporatised way. It's a very kind of top-down sort of, the benefits might trickle down to the whānau. And a lot of whānau aren't very convinced of that. So there must be other kinds of economic models, other ways. I see our tūna whānau in the audience who have been doing their own whānau-driven economic initiatives to to harness that potential, not just top down but bottom up. What are the challenges? And one of the other things I think is pretty important, when I look at my own whānau, with my dad and his brother, one raised in Parihaka, one raised in Tūranga Waiwai, and between them they've got 8 moko and only 1 born in Aotearoa. You know, and that's just kind of the reality of whānau. So given that, how do you maintain connectedness to home in that context of mobility is a big challenge. And of course we've got these growing regional differences. So most of the Māori population growth is coming from that growth triangle, Auckland, Bay of Plenty, Waikato. Okay, that's where it's been driven. Waikato iwi is lucky. We're right in the middle of that growth triangle. But obviously there's lots of variation, like we showed in education, within the Waikato region as well. We've got deepening regional inequalities, and we've got the end of growth in many areas, which is irreversible, largely irreversible. And so what is that going to mean for iwi living in those areas where population decline is about to happen or has already happened, is going to deepen? If you think about that kind of relationship between whakapapa and whenua, other people might be able to move out of the region, and whānau will move out of the region, but the basis of the hapu and marae and iwi identity always has to be linked to place in some form. So what are the challenges and how to meet them? So just my last slide, concluding thoughts. And in the broader context, kind of balancing that growing collective Māori wealth with these increasing inequalities within Te Ao Māori and within Aotearoa is really important. How do we do that? How do we continue to maintain our Māori distinctiveness amidst this rapid migration-driven ethnic change? How can we continue to be both local and global people? We want to be both. Should we have to choose? Do we have to start choosing? And this process of kind of population and economic innovation is an ongoing process. We're going to keep changing. It's going to keep changing. Things don't stop, get fossilised in time. But how can we be one step ahead and kind of anticipating that change and the implications that fall out of it? So I'm sure that was much longer than my time allotted. And thank you much for enduring it. Kia ora.
Transition to Ross, so we're going from the national kind of district kind of perspective, and Ross is going to reflect on his life and experiences and research into Hauora Māori. Nā reira, tēnā koe nau mai kara mai.
Kia ora, Richard. Tihau Māori ora I ngā māta waka e huhi nei e rao rangatira mā. Ngā mihi nui ki a katou. Kia te mai nei e te karanga o te wā, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Ross Lawrenson, tōku ingoa. So I am one of those imports that Tahu was talking about. I come from a place called Horsham in England, and we don't really have a maunga in Sussex. We have what we call the Downs. So many of you will know Horsham Downs, just out of Hamilton. But my maunga really is here, Shanktonbury Hill, which is actually an old Roman temple site on the top of the Downs. My awa is the River Arun, which comes from Horsham down to the south coast. And Arundel Castle is the castle that guards that awa from invasion from the French. And my people were the South Saxons from Sussex, and my mother's family have come from villages and farm workers from that region. And my father's family came from the north area, Norfolk, or the North Saxons. So I'm really talking on a Pākehā perspective on Hauora Māori, and particularly Hauora Māori research and my research over those years. I first came to New Zealand in 1981, which seems just like yesterday, but is I realise a long time ago now I worked at Tikawiti Hospital when we had 3 surgeons there, and a physician, an anaesthetist and house surgeons, and I worked for John Mandano, who was the medical superintendent. And as I arrived fresh off the plane from England, I was given a 20-page document to read on tikanga practice for Māori, written by a young medical student called Dr. David Tiffany Leach, who I have to say was a great introduction. And one of my abiding memories of working at Tikawiti back in 1981 was the privilege of going to a weaving session with Rangimarie Hetet and learning about Māori weaving, and that was just so inspirational at the time. I didn't realise how privileged I was until I went to a British Museum exhibition a few years ago of her weaving in Britain, and that was a fantastic opportunity. So I had to go back to England shortly after that with my mother being ill, but we so loved New Zealand that I applied for jobs. I was rejected from Tolaga Bay, but I was offered a job in Waira. So I came out to Waira, and I see that was top of the statistics for a Māori community on the East Coast. In 1983, there were 13,500 people in Waira. It's now less than 9,000. But it was a fantastic experience for me. This is my 4th child, Stephen, who was born in Waira, so that is his te ranga waiwai, and he's now teaching in Wellington. And I worked in general practice there, and then became superintendent of the hospital, and obviously with the Takatimu Marae there and the heart place of Ngāti Kahungunu, they were very much part of the governance group of the hospital, and Lena Manuel was a colleague and friend on that time. And of course we spent our time there not only in Waira but going up into the Ureweras and Waikare Moana, and really learning about the region and its people. And I have to say that this is where I was converted from being a general practitioner to being a public health doctor. I spent most of my time writing letters about housing conditions and water conditions and all of those other things for my patients in Waira, rather than dishing out lots of antibiotics for school sores and worrying about the rheumatic fever that was so prevalent then. So in 1988 I came back to the Waikato as Superintendent of Community Services and District Hospitals, took over from Rex Wright Sinclair, and of course it probably didn't realise that it was unusual there. We had a Chief Executive, Glenn Garlick, who was Māori. Deputy Chief Executive was Wayne McLean, and so very much the health board was very much, or the hospital board at that time was very much aimed at dealing with the health needs of Māori. So Glenn supported my first research project, which was a project looking at undiagnosed diabetes in Māori and rural communities within the Waikato. And we did that as a community development program. We went to 3 communities. We engaged with those communities around the issue around diabetes, and then we set up, in conjunction with those communities, screening programs. We started at Matamata and Waharoa, and we were very lucky that that opening day we had the Minister of Health, who was Helen Clark at the time. It was a freezing July day, and she had her finger pricked, and we had to squeeze, and we couldn't get any blood out of but that was a tremendous opportunity. And then we went to Waihi Marae, and again another abiding memory was the support we had from Dame Te Atarangi Kahu, who was came and supported us in our endeavours about dealing with the issue of diabetes for Māori, and she supported our program right through that period. And we have pictures there of Pam Asher and Pai Hall, who were the nurses down in Turangi, and Pai ran a ronga clinic as well as running our diabetes services down there. And this is Susan Ryan, who is now the head of the diabetes service here in the Waikato, but was very much the project manager. So we showed through that project, this is undiagnosed diabetes, which was a small problem in Pakeha, around 1%, but 6% of our Māori people that we screened at that time had undiagnosed diabetes. And we also looked at the proportion of people who were visiting a doctor. So this was a community survey. We met people on marae and in other community settings. And one of the things we asked them was about, have you seen your general practitioner? So Europeans were 50% more likely to have seen a GP in the last year than Māori. Men were much less likely to go and see their doctors, we know. Smokers, interestingly, you think smokers would be sick and go to their doctor all the time, but in fact smokers were 30% less likely to go to their doctor because they get nagged about their health. So that was a really important project. I'm proud of that project because we left behind a diabetes service that's now probably the preeminent diabetes service in New Zealand. We have more diabetes nurses in the community than any other health board in the region. And I went back to the UK and wrote that up as my doctorate, and then got stuck back in the UK for longer than we expected. We came back to Waikato in 2005, and at that time the Te Wairona Diabetes Prevention Strategy run by David Simmons had been running for around 2 years. It was on its 5th project manager, and I think 6 or 7 staff had come and gone. And so we tried to re-invitalise what was in fact in vision a fantastic program, and again had engaged the community right across the Waikato about not only undiagnosed diabetes, but actually the most important part of it was to try and prevent the development of diabetes for Māori. That project ran into a number of problems, and I'm happy to talk about those, but it certainly gave me a lot of learnings about how not to do things as far as research with Māori are concerned. But again, one of the findings, this is undiagnosed diabetes just in Māori, showing that it's higher rates in men compared with women, but very similar rates to what we'd found a few years earlier. And then we went on to do some more work with Grace Joshua, who was our PhD student at the time, and looking at diabetes in the general population. So this is known diabetes, this is not the undiagnosed diabetes. And this is showing by now, this is in 2009, the rates in Pakeha of around 10% in those over the age of 60. But this is the rates of diagnosed diabetes in Māori. So 40% of those in 70 plus are living with diabetes, and over 20% in 60 plus. So huge issue that's still around well-being of the population, and a huge disparity between Māori and non-Māori around rates of diabetes. So with our learnings from Te Wairona, the next project that we were involved in was an HRC, another HRC project looking at whanaora approaches to health, which were back in 2008-9 were relatively new, and we were exploring within the Waikato DHB the concepts of how to deliver whanaora, and we were asked to evaluate that. So in conjunction with Te Puna Oranga, the Māori Health Unit of the Waikato District Health Board, and Wayne Johnston was a worker and researcher within the unit at the time. So Wayne led that project, and I worked with Jackie Kidd, and here we have Kay Berryman and Erin Akara and Rawadi Blundell were also involved in that project, working with this whanaora approach. And I have to say most of those whanaora workers were those who had been workers on the Te Wairona project beforehand and carried on in a different role, but with the learnings from that project. We published a paper around a whanaora approach to healthcare based on the hui that we'd had with Kaumatua at our clinic, and from that, Erina and the team then developed a framework for researching and evaluating whanaora programs using what we've published and called the Te Korowai approach to evaluation, looking at those key guiding principles of health for Māori that came out of those hui with our kaumātua who guided that process. And we have used this framework for further research and evaluation of other health projects. The next, really, from working with diabetes, I then got into issues around cancer and death and dying. I had a Dot Smythe, who was a local GP who wanted to do some research in palliative care. And as Kahu says, I have an interest in rural health from my time in Waira. And so we did a research project with rural GPs around palliative care needs, and particularly for Māori. Very much guided by a friend and colleague, Paratini Nato, who had published widely on this in the 1990s and was a great mentor and supporter for me. And that really then led to the opportunity when the HRC put out a bid for a study on health literacy and palliative care to work in conjunction with Ra'awa again and putting in a bid for that, and we were fortunate to get that funding. That was a really interesting process. Having gone through the Te Wairona program, I was very keen to make sure that we were supporting rather than leading projects. And so Rangi Mahora Reddy, who was the manager, or is the manager of Ra'awa, became the lead investigator for that project, supported not only by me but by John Ertzl and Mary Simpson from the management school. First thing that struck me was normally if we send an HRC project and get funding, you know, they just sign the contract. For Ra'awa, they had to go through a due diligence approach. So they had to show that they had insurance for $10 million in case anything went wrong. They had to have an audit of all of their financial affairs before they were allowed to take up this grant. So I think at the end of it, Rangi Mahora was thinking, why am I doing this? But the bureaucracy for Māori to lead these projects, certainly the structures weren't there. But it was a very successful project. And had certainly informed the ministry around the information needs and health needs for Māori around palliative care. Following that, we were lucky enough to get into further research around cancer and primary care, and I need to acknowledge the team, particularly here, Nina Scott, who is our Māori physician with the public health unit at Waikato District Health Board, and Nina's been our Māori guide and advisor, Rawiri Blundell, who at that time was leading the Māori support group for Hei Parakiki, the cancer network, and of course Carice at the front here, who has been the manager of our project. I'm looking around the project because everybody knows that this is September and that it's Blue September. So our first project was, of course, around prostate cancer. So all of the men who are 50 plus in this room, I hope you've had your visit to the doctor. But certainly that project funded by the HRC again was looking at access and treatment around prostate cancer, really to look at improving care. But one of the issues that we looked at was the issue of equity. So you can see here that first of all, Māori, 19% of Māori at diagnosis already have terminal disease. They have metastatic disease that has already spread, which is twice as many as in New Zealand Europeans. So mostly young people have localised disease, but we have a number of people who have metastatic disease at diagnosis, and many of these were Māori. And by the time we came to try and interview Māori men with prostate cancer, many of them had tragically already died. And that's because people with metastatic disease, 75% will be dead within 3 years. And so it's really important to catch these conditions and cancer early and get early diagnosis. And we looked at the uptake of screening between Māori and Pākehā, and found that Māori were half as likely to be tested and half as likely to be screened as non-Māori. And so there were huge disparities there around the screening rates. But not only were there disparities around screening, but if Māori had an abnormal test, here are the rates of people being referred. So you go to your doctor, you have a test. If the test is abnormal, then you should be referred on to a specialist for further investigation. We found that Māori were less likely to be referred if they had a positive test. And if they got to see the specialist, then we found that only 56% of those who got to the specialist were given a biopsy, compared with 65% of non-Māori. So there are differentials in the management of treatment, but if you did get there and did get investigated, actually Māori were significantly more likely to be diagnosed with an underlying cancer. There are also not only differences in that management pathway, but also in the form of treatment that's being used. So Māori were less likely to have surgery or a prostatectomy, are more likely to be treated with radiotherapy. And this is what we call watchful waiting or active surveillance, which is a non-interventional monitoring of people and then only treating if people are progressing. And we found that Māori were 50% more likely to be treated with conservative management. And this all leads to the disparity in outcomes. So that this is the overall disparity for Māori. So Māori are twice as likely to die from their prostate cancer if they are diagnosed. But if they're diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer, then they're 3 times more likely to die than non-Māori. So big disparities that we've shown in the management and outcomes for Māori from prostate cancer. Our current project is looking at breast cancer. And again, very similar graphs to prostate cancer. Māori twice as likely to die from breast cancer compared with New Zealand Europeans. Again, differences in management. So Māori, there's a gap. There's the average gap for treatment for Pakeha is 36 days, but for Māori it's 8 days longer, 44 days, and for Pacific it's even longer, 48 days. Māori are more likely to be treated with radical treatment or mastectomy, less likely to have breast conservation surgery, and are more likely to need palliative care or have no surgery because they are diagnosed later with more advanced disease. Māori are less likely to have their or continue with their adjuvant hormonal therapy that prevents recurrence of cancer. So 80% of Pakeha at the end of 1 year were still taking their endocrine therapy, but only 65% of Māori. So all of these things add up incrementally to differences. And of course the other issue is around screening. We've seen the differences in screening for prostate cancer. There's also differences for breast cancer. So 65%, 64% of Pakeha who are eligible for, are diagnosed in the screening age group are picked up through screening, but only 50% of Māori. So Māori are less likely to be screened, and for Pacific even less at 41%. But the big lesson here, I think, is that if you are picked up through screening, the outcomes for Māori are exactly the same. And that's because our national screening program has an audited program that ensures equity of management and treatment for all patients picked up through that scheme. Whereas if you're picked up opportunistically with a breast lump and referred into the public health system, then Māori do much worse than non-Māori in our current system. And so we really need to do something about improving those outcomes. And you can improve uptake of screening. And my friend and colleague Rachel Thompson, who's a GP in Te Kaha and Te Whana Apanui, she has shown that you can increase screening rates in Māori from 35% to 95% just through a community development approach and through involvement of general practice in that screening. And she published that paper a few years ago and has continued to have those very high rates, demonstrating that the disparity in screening can be addressed. So that's really just a run through of my journey in Māori research. It is still continuing. I think what I hope to do as a public health physician is just highlight the needs and the disparities, not only in outcomes but in management and treatment, and show where the opportunities are for dealing with that. I think I've enjoyed most success when we've really had that community involvement in our research, and it has been co-design of our projects and working with the communities, whether that's been with diabetes, with our whānau order work, or with our palliative care work. One of our challenges is supporting Māori researchers to do this research, and we've had Wayne Johnson and Rangi Mahora, both really early stage researchers, being supported by our team. And we need to build the capacity of more Māori researchers in the health field, and we have some of that going on at the moment. We have some really excellent young Māori clinicians in Waikato Hospital who are doing their PhDs and going into research. And we do need to explore further kaupapa Māori research and research methodologies to give different paradigms to our learnings about how we improve outcomes and care for Māori. We have got a lot of work still going on. We still are finishing off a further breast cancer proposal. We have a Māori student doing his PhD on health literacy for women with breast cancer. Tamati can't be here today because he's in one of the other sessions, I think, giving a talk. We have a Māori researcher, Mara Ruka, who is starting to do some work on myeloma. She's a specialist in haematology, and I believe will have a great future in research once she gets the specialist exams out of the way, which are facing her at the moment. We've just put in a bid for a study on long-term conditions, particularly around diabetes, again, with Brendan Hokofitu and the Māori Research Unit, and Jade Tamatea, who's another Māori physician at the hospital, will be leading on that. We're putting in a EOI around lung cancer research, and again we're looking at wanting to do a community development approach to that. And Jackie Kidd and Rawari and ourselves are working with the True North Foundation to put together a study and a program for supporting Māori men with prostate cancer, which is getting funding, as I say, from the Movember group. So a lot of further work to do. I'm really excited by the opportunities of working with Tahu and Nydia. I had the choice of going first or second, and I took the wrong choice. I should have gone first. It's really hard to follow such a great talk from Tahu, but I think there's lots of synergies on how we can work together to further the agenda for Māori health. So, kia ora tātou. Thank you very much for listening.